Welcome to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk.
Hey everyone, it's Jenny Lisk, and this is episode 33 of the Widowed Parent Podcast. I had such a great discussion with Arlen Gaines and Meredith Polsky for this episode. Meredith and Arlen are social workers who have written a book series called I Have a Question for kids with autism. One of their books is about death and another is about cancer. I heard them present on a webinar for the National Alliance for Grieving Children on the topic of grief and kids with autism, and realized that would probably be of interest to some of my listeners. Some of the topics we cover in our discussion include the fact that there's a lack of literature on death and dying for kids who are concrete thinkers, some common features of autism that we should keep in mind when we think about how to help our grieving children and teens, developmental responses to grief that we see with typically developing kids in each age group and how that might be different for kids with autism, tips for making participation in a peer grief group or camp a successful experience for a child with autism, some thoughts on how to deal with the loss of routine and schedule after the loss of a parent, some of the euphemisms that our culture has around death that can be confusing to people with autism, and strategies for helping kids with autism remember and honor their deceased parent. I hope you enjoy my discussion with Meredith Polsky and Arlen Gaines. My guests today are Meredith Polsky and Arlen Gaines, both social workers and co-authors of the book series I Have a Question. They're joining us today from Maryland. Arlen and Meredith, welcome.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
Thank you, Jenny.
Yeah, so I've invited you both here today to talk about the topic of grief as it relates to kids with autism. And when I heard you guys present a webinar for the National Alliance for Grieving Children, I knew that it was a topic that we needed to cover on the podcast. I think it's something that will be useful for my listeners. So I'm really glad you're both here today. So let me first ask you both, just to start us off, how did you come to start thinking about this topic of autism and grief?
So this is Arlen here. And again, thank you so much, Jenny, for the opportunity to be here on this podcast. And what a meaningful series that you produce. I'm really glad to be part of it. So I've been working for a number of years as a hospice social worker, and I've had the privilege of caring for many patients and families over the course of that time. And over the years, I noticed a trend that many of the children or grandchildren of my patients had special needs, were on the autism spectrum, and many of the families were struggling with finding appropriate resources to support them. And this lack of literature on death and dying for very concrete thinkers became even more apparent when my own grandmother was in the dying process, and I brought my trusty stack of books home to my own kids, and one of them, who's a very concrete thinker, cast them all aside and said, why are you bringing me these books that are about animals? Why are you bringing me books that are about leaves falling off the trees? We are talking about my grandmother. What does this have to do with anything? So it really got me thinking. And, I realized that most of the books that we use for children try to cushion it by using animals as the main characters or metaphors that can be really out of reach for many children, including children with autism spectrum disorder. So I decided I wanted to tackle this project and spent a whole number of years researching and decided I wanted to write a book that would address death and dying in a real concrete manner, in a way that was accessible for all children, inclusive of those with special needs. And I really, after a while, realized I do need some help. I can bring the expertise on grief, but I checked in with my colleague and friend Meredith Polsky, who's here with me today, because I needed the special education expertise. And luckily for me, she said yes, and our project was rolling. And I'll turn it over to Meredith.
Yeah. And again, Jenny, thanks for having us on your podcast. And I think Arlen gives, a really good overview of why we're doing what we're doing. It's not often that you discover such a total lack of resources, in a specific area. And we both have really built our careers on trying to fill unmet needs, particularly as it pertains to, sort of underserved populations or less represented populations. Arlen through hospice social work, myself through social work and special education and inclusion. And so when she came to me, it just made a ton of sense, because I was accustomed to working with all kinds of different children who don't process information in the ways that other children might, and don't understand metaphors, as Arlen mentioned, in the way that a typically developing child might. And so when she told me that there really weren't, sort of straightforward resources to help children with special needs navigate death and grief, I thought, wow, how could that even be, And so I was really excited to, work on this project with her and try to fill a need, which I think we've really done, and continue to do as best as we can, spreading the word and things like that. And also not just through the book, but, through people like yourself who are, really trying to understand what makes it different for kids with autism and other special needs, and really addressing it head on, being part of the solution of making sure that this is a population of children that people are thinking about. And I think, one of the most important things I've learned in my career, and it's been no different, with these books, is that special education is just really good education. So what works well for children with special needs or disabilities works well for all kids. So in our own small way, I hope we're also bridging the gap between, parents of typical kids, parents of kids with special needs, because in many ways the struggles are similar.
Yeah. Okay. You guys have said so much already that I'm thinking about here, so I can tell this is going to be a good discussion. I'm glad I caught you guys on that previous webinar, because I have to say it hadn't occurred to me that kids or teenagers with autism, that there might be any special considerations or needs or challenges or approaches that might be different. So I'm really glad that you guys could join me today to talk about this. Let's start out just to kind of level set. So briefly, what is autism? And then can you give us some quick facts about autism today? Absolutely.
So autism, which, the full term is autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. It's pretty commonplace to refer to it as autism. It's a neurological developmental disability. It is a spectrum disorder. That's the ASD part, which means that there's a very wide range of how it can impact a particular individual all across the spectrum. Autism may have a genetic component, but the cause of it is still unclear. People with autism are affected by autism from early childhood onward. So while there's not a cure for autism, we have seen many individuals benefit from early intervention services and early therapies to help bridge some of the developmental delays that occur with autism. Autism-related impairments may become more apparent later in life, especially as children start elementary school or their day-to-day settings become more demanding, and the differences between them and their peers may become clearer. Currently, the statistics show that 1 in 59 children in the United States have autism. That's a number that's grown significantly over the past several years. And I think, in large part, that's because we're just better at identifying it. Not necessarily that there are so many more people with autism, but we're getting better at diagnosing. The prevalence of autism in boys is 5 times that of girls. That also might be overstated because girls with autism present very differently. So while overall we've gotten better at diagnosing autism, it's still more of a challenge in girls because it does manifest differently. It's the fastest growing developmental disability in the United States. As I said before, there's no medical detection or cure for autism. And I think it's really important to note that families with children with autism, it costs them an average of over $60,000 per year in therapies and different supports and educational services and things like that. And so we're really sensitive to that. And, one of the reasons we love doing podcasts like yours and just trying to get the word out is because we don't want resources to be an extra burden on families. We want them to be there when they're looking for them, because they do have, financial burdens that far exceed those of most parents of typical children. So in terms of it being a developmental disability, any number of things can be affected, from motor development to speech development, cognitive, but again, it's a spectrum. So you could have one delay without another, or one really significant impairment and something else is very much intact. And there's a saying that, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. We hesitate to make generalizations, but of course it helps, as you said, sort of leveling the playing field in terms of people's understanding of, what exactly it is that we're talking about.
Yeah. Well, let's go a little bit deeper on that then. As you said, it is a spectrum and there's so many different ways it might present. But can we talk a little bit about some of the common features that might really come into play here when you're thinking about kids or people in general with autism? Some of those common features that we might need to be aware of as parents and take into account.
Absolutely. So as I mentioned, there may be motor skill impairments, and that might be fine motor, like a person's ability to write or to draw or anything like that. It might be more gross motor, sort of coordination and ability to, to run or play sports or things like that. Some people with autism have movement disorders, which makes it difficult for them to control the ways in which their body moves. A lot of people, maybe most people with autism, struggle with executive function. So sort of that ability to organize everyday tasks and, follow them through to completion. There may be impairments in expressive and or receptive communication. So when we think about receptive communication, it's our ability to understand language, and not just language, but also visual cues and facial expressions, which are often very difficult for people with autism to master. That's often a sort of trademark of autism. It's very difficult to read those sorts of social cues. And when we say expressive language, it's the ability to produce language that's relevant and appropriate to the conversation at hand. So you might have somebody with autism who speaks, perfectly well in their language and their vocabulary, and they're able to take, part in conversations. And, on the other end, you might have somebody with autism who's completely nonverbal, who's not able to produce words. But again, the cognitive ability of each of those people, we don't know simply based on their ability to produce language. And people are often judged based on that, but we really need to figure out other ways of communicating so that we can really understand where they're at. People with autism have sensory processing differences, so or sensory processing disorders. So they may be, extraordinarily sensitive to sounds or touch or taste, much more so than, a typically developing person. So they may become really, overwhelmed and overstimulated in a crowded place or someplace they're not accustomed to. They may have trouble eating because they're extra sensitive to different textures and tastes. Lots of different things that can be impacted there. And a lot of people with autism have unusually intense special interests. And that's not to say, I think there's like sort of this like pop culture phenomenon of like a savant kind of thing. And that's actually relatively rare. But what's much more common is sort of this hyper focus on specific things. So it might be on trains where, the individual knows, every train schedule of, every metro system in the United States, or it might be, bugs or animals or, really any number of different things where they're really, really expert in those. Sometimes, interfering with their ability to take interest in other things or to follow a conversation that's not about those things, sort of always wanting to interject, something about trains or bugs, which, can be challenging in everyday conversation or in a school setting, where you have to, learn about other things. But generally speaking, that's sort of like my quick list on, the things that are common features of people with autism.
Yeah. Okay. And did you mention, what about the question about reading social cues? Is that something that can be challenging as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I touched on it, but it's definitely worth expanding on. It's one of the sort of cornerstones of autism is this difficulty understanding social cues. So, and it sort of goes back to what Arlen was saying about like metaphors and things like that, like things that aren't concrete, in and of themselves can be really hard to process. So, you might give me a look right now that's telling me like, okay, stop talking. You've said enough. Not that you are. I want the listeners to know you haven't done that. But somebody with autism wouldn't be able to pick up on that. Right? So,
so it seems like then thinking about some of the things you mentioned, I'm going to take a guess at the ones that might present particular difficulty. Now, if we're bringing this back to a situation where a parent has died, we're talking about grief. It seems like the expressive and receptive language, potential difficulties, the social cues thing, and the concrete thinking. Those seem like they might be particular areas that would pop up as challenging.
Yes, agreed. And, one example, so say at a funeral, we know that there are people who are crying, and we know that there are sometimes people who are laughing. Well, that can be really confusing for a child who's struggling to understand the social cues. Why would someone be laughing at a funeral? Well, they're laughing because maybe they're sharing some funny stories or something touching about the person and brings back some warm memories. So that would be just a little example of how confusing it can be, this trying to understand, trying to figure out read the emotions of others in the midst of grief, in the midst of dying.
That makes a lot of sense.
Compounded.
Yeah.
And I think also to your point about like expressive language and receptive language, you, Jenny, had said at the beginning when we started speaking that until you heard our webinar, you hadn't really considered that the grief process might look a little bit different or need to be approached a little bit differently for people with autism. And I think there's assumptions on the other end too, right? Like if an individual isn't able to express what they're feeling, in words or, in appropriate language or what we deem to be appropriate language, then we might assume that they're not grieving or they don't know what's going on or this, we don't need to talk to them about grief because they don't get it, it's not relevant to them, when in fact the opposite may be true. They may be the person who most needs to be communicated with about it, but everybody's sort of skipping over them.
Okay. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Okay. And so then thinking about maybe some of the typical advice or approaches to children's grief that is, maybe given for typically developing children, what do you think or what have you seen or what kind of advice would you have around maybe things that need to be modified, things that you that might work very well for typically developing children, but that just are not going to work with a kid with autism?
So we assume that all kids are grieving, even if they have autism. And so I think going to Meredith's point, even some people who may not be showing, maybe expressively how they're feeling, we're going to assume that all kids are grieving. And I think the main point we want to make is that children with autism spectrum disorder may be processing information more related to their developmental stage rather than their chronological age. So we think about different strategies we use with all children. Maybe some of our younger children we may approach in a certain way, and maybe older teens, maybe less of sort of art projects, or maybe we do a lot of art actually with older kids, but maybe we might approach older teens in a certain way. We may need to remember that maybe some of our older teens with autism may actually be processing information more akin to a child who's in elementary school. So we can expand on that and talk about some of the developmental stages and
let's jump into that.
A little bit of that. Yeah, that might be helpful. But I think that's the main thing we want to convey.
Okay, let's go through that if you don't mind, because I think that you guys have some interesting information on those different developmental responses, and for breaking down different age groups and how it might be different than for a child with autism in that particular age group. So maybe start with like elementary, or where do you want to start?
Yeah, we can start with elementary. So even the youngest kids were elementary, we're sort of thinking maybe 6 to 10 or so. But when we think about even some of our younger kids, even younger than 6, many of them who are typically developing often engage in what we call magical thinking. Magical thinking is this idea that maybe something I said or something I did caused the person's death. Or maybe if I wish hard enough, I can wish and wish and they're going to come back. So we often see in our sort of younger younger range, and maybe sort of younger elementary, a little bit of the magical thinking. Kids in elementary age typically are starting to understand the permanence of death. They might be interested in kind of the biological or scientific aspects. Some of the broader questions might emerge, sort of why a little bit. And certainly for kids, we may expect to see some mood changes and some behavior changes perhaps related to the change in routine. But when we think about our kind of elementary school age kids with autism, we typically find that they are not engaged in magical thinking. The sort of making connections outside the box often does not occur to them. So whereas that's something we might be addressing with our younger kids, we typically are not seeing that as much in our kids with autism. And the kids on the spectrum often are really drawn to the very scientific aspects of death. So I'll give an example, drawn in a way that relates to their special interests. So I worked with one family who have an 8-year-old child with autism, and he was understanding dying through math because math was his strong suit. So, and his parents, they were very helpful in explaining the death of their loved one who was dying, and was saying, this person, they're in the dying process, their body is at about 50%. And he said, okay, I understand they're at 50%. And as they were getting closer to dying, the parents said, this person is at about 25%. And he said, okay, I get that. And when the person died, they told the child, and he said, oh, I get it, they died. The person is at 0%. So that's what made sense to the child, because he was processing it through his special interests in a very concrete manner.
Mm-hmm. I could see how this potential, a child being drawn to the scientific aspects of death, if that's not well understood, could actually potentially upset some people. If they're asking very detailed questions about, the body or different things, and some people may be thinking that was inappropriate and not understanding that that's just part of how they process things.
I think that's such a great point, Jenny, because, when we have a parent who's grieving, or, anybody who's grieving, there's this extreme challenge of navigating one's own grief and navigating the grief of their child, right? And so if that child is not typically developing or is on the spectrum, it does take an extra level of, patience and understanding to manage our own grief and sort of make the leap to where they're coming from in terms of like, okay, yeah, we got to talk about the science and not the emotion, whatever it is.
Yeah.
I think that's a really excellent point.
So how about moving on to more the middle school type years?
Yep, absolutely. So we see for our typically developing kids in middle school, they've pretty much gotten down the idea of the permanence of death. They get this person is not coming back, and their abstract thinking broadens. They're starting to think of some of the bigger picture questions, and sometimes even moving into some of the spiritual considerations. But really in middle school, the main thing we're seeing for kids is that they are wanting to fit in. They are all about their peers, and they really may be seeking more support from their peers and starting to move away from some of the adults a little bit. What we see with our kids with autism in middle school, unfortunately, one of the challenges often for kids is making friends and having a strong, safe peer support group. It really can be a challenge. So they may not have the same support system. Often kids on the spectrum may have a safe adult at school. It might be a special educator, a therapist, a special teacher, an administrator, a counselor. So of course we want to encourage, those connections, but that's where we see a big difference. There may be less of the abstract thinking, and again, still that continued focus on some of the biological, scientific aspects of this experience. Really also, again, maybe processing the experience very much like some of the earlier developmental stages. So even though they may be 12 or 13, it's quite possible they might be processing this more like a 6 or 7-year-old. So start keeping that in mind.
So it sounds like, this peer support issue is an interesting one. It sounds like there may be then kind of double factors for potential peer isolation. One being the challenges of having autism, and the second being the challenge of having lost a parent and being different in that way. Both of those might tend to isolate a kid. So that sounds like something for parents to be aware of and on the lookout for. Yep.
I completely agree. And it's why we think about, as a social worker, I'm always coming from a strengths-based perspective. So I'm always thinking about, okay, so we know there are things that are not working so well, but what is working? What works in this child's life? Where can we draw on support? Where can we draw on strength? And maybe we need to double down on our efforts on the places that do work, and really kind of push a little harder to get some more support. So it might be that safe adult at school. It might be that middle schooler, maybe we can schedule a morning and an afternoon check-in with that safe adult at school. So we can be creative, but sort of always keeping in mind sort of what is the strength of this child and of their system.
And I think that's one thing we're also going to touch on probably a bit later as you have more questions for us. But this idea of not treating, this loss as something totally and completely separate and different from everything else in the child's life, but to really think about what supports and what strategies have been helpful for the child during other challenging times. And like Arlen said, really build on those to help them address the grief as well.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, good. And then how about as we move into the high school years, teenage years?
Sure. So, high school, we know for our typically developing kids is all about self-identity and again, peer support. So they may be hiding their feelings, or they may be very open with their feelings. They may be turning to their friends. We certainly may see mood swings or challenges at school. They're often really moving into the broader questions. They've well understood the permanence of death, and they may be exploring sort of some of the more spiritual, existential aspects of the idea of losing a parent. What does this mean to me? This parent is not going to be at my graduation, and what that's going to be like, some of these broader questions and difficulties. And again, our teens who are on the autism spectrum, again, may not have that peer support. And that is often one of the most distinguishing factors. They also may be struggling with emotional regulation. We have all the hormones going too. It's teenage years, so that sort of is still there. And again, trouble interpreting social cues. Kids in high school are often talking in a really complex kind of way, and so sort of just general understanding social cues, and then we layer on top of it this loss and the death of a parent. Or someone they love in their lives, and they just really might be processing the experience with less abstraction. And again, keeping in mind that even though they might look like a big teenager in a 16, 17-year-old body, we have to remember, again, what's their developmental stage, maybe not necessarily their chronological age.
Yeah. Okay. And then as you move into college age, kind of young adult, is that similar to high school, or are there some additional considerations?
Very similar. I mean, I think by the time we move into young adulthood, we have such a range of experiences. We have some of our kids on the spectrum who are at college and who are functioning in a mainstream environment. We have some who are trying to move into sort of more, what's their living situation? Are they living at home? So there's just such a range of what's going on, but it's quite possible that some of the young adults on the spectrum might be more socially isolated, again, have less peer support, again, may have some difficulty managing some of the social aspects of grief, especially at the funeral or cemetery, just the challenges of being thrown into an unknown situation. For our high school age, for kids who are in school, there's actually a sense of routine that typically comes with school. Sometimes after the school years, it can be even a little more challenging because that routine is changing. So, we sort of have adjusting to adult routines, and layer on top of that, grief.
Yeah.
So it just gets more complicated.
Okay. Well, thank you. I think that's a good overview of some of the key differences by age group, and I think that'll be really useful. So thank you for taking the time to go through that. Maybe turning to some practical questions here. If there are some excellent grief groups in various cities around the country, peer support type groups. If a parent of a child or a teenager with autism was interested in having their kid join one of those, do you have any suggestions for how to make that successful? Does that work, or are there some challenges that our parents should be aware of?
Yeah, I think as with anything that a parent might be seeking out for their child with special needs or with autism specifically, doing their research ahead of time is something that these parents are very accustomed to. And I would say, again, utilize those strengths, through this grief process as well, and recognize that the ways in which you research any kind of program really apply to, any sort of grief group also. So really, sort of doing your homework ahead of time to understand, how the group is going to be structured or what the program is going to be like, and really communicate with those providers about the kinds of strategies that work best for your child, being upfront about the kinds of accommodations that might need to be in place in order for your child to be successful. Really, coming to an understanding of who the rest of the group is going to be, what, sort of who the cohort is, and having an honest conversation with the providers about what would and wouldn't or might not work for your particular child. And I think the more that we can communicate with each other up front, the fewer surprises there are going to be, the better we can prepare our kids for the program. And also, to make sure that the people running the programs or the groups, first of all, understand, the potential challenges for the child, and also have certain backup plans in place. What happens if the child becomes overwhelmed? What happens if, there are certain sensory things going on that the child isn't able to cope with? And really thinking ahead of time about how we're going to be able to set the child up for success. And again, I think the more that the providers and the parents can communicate, and come to a really mutual understanding of expectations and things like that, the more successful the child can be, and the more prepared the group or the program can be to accept that child.
So, and it sounds like that same advice would apply then if the parent is looking at a grief camp for their child, which could be kind of like the group, but more of it, overnight away. It sounds like, probably very similar types of advice and considerations there. Have you seen that be successful, kids with autism going to grief camp?
I don't have a lot of, I know parents explore it. I quite honestly haven't sort of heard back about how was their specific experience at the camp. So I don't feel like I can fully answer that question, but I do know I'm in touch with various providers at different camps just throughout this process of writing this book. And we know that, many camps have picked up our book, that our providers are really working hard to be inclusive. And I've really been very moved by sort of this effort to just how can we really meet the kids. I just sort of have this sense of that out there in the community. So I'm hopeful that camps can work. Again, as Meredith mentioned, just really having great communication ahead of time to help the child succeed. Because the worst thing would be to send the child to an experience that's not going to work for them and have them leave in the middle of it. And they're also dealing with the grief. And it can be so hard on so many ways. So we want to make sure it can work. I've seen some people do sort of mini versions. So maybe it's not the overnight camp, but maybe it's sort of a day version. I've seen that once. So maybe there may be some options there.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of routine and schedule for kids with autism, and then how losing a parent may affect that?
So we know for all kids and for adults, myself included, structure and routine is great. We love structure and routine. It just gives us a sense of control, a sense of safety, a sense of normalcy. And so we know, especially for our children with autism, changes in routine are particularly difficult, and being flexible and adapting to changes are really, really hard. So when we think about the death of a parent, we know this will certainly have a direct impact on the child. And then we think about the nature of this death. So was this a parent who's been sick for a long time? Were they on hospice? Was this an expected death? Was there time to work on sort of anticipatory grief issues and thinking ahead of time about the change in schedule and how we might be adapting? Or was this a sudden loss? And did everything happen all of a sudden? Was it abrupt? And one day, mom was driving them to school, and the next day she's not. So certainly the nature of the person's dying and the role, that parent's role in the child's life sort of greatly impact this experience. So we can share some strategies, but basically as much as possible, we like to help the child know what to expect. And despite a really difficult time, conveying this message of there is a plan for you, that we are in this time of a lot of change, but there will be a plan for you, and we will help you know what to expect as much as we can, and we will do our best, and we know you'll need to be flexible, but we want to assure you there will be a plan for you. And we're happy to share, some sort of specific strategies around how to
Sure. Yeah, let's jump into that. Let's jump into that, sure.
Yeah, so there are ways that special educators or therapists or parents really help kids with autism prepare for what's next in general. And again, we want to utilize those same techniques and strategies during this challenging time as well. So one of the things that is really like the cornerstone of our book is the use of a short picture story, which is really, also a cornerstone of just, working with lots of different kinds of kids. And basically it focuses on visuals and sort of like shorthand language, so that we're not getting the kids bogged down in lots of narrative or lots of language or lots of instructions or lots of talking about what's going to happen and what's going to be next or whatever. And it really becomes sort of like a reference point for the child, that, an adult would go over with them initially, but then it's really something that the child can refer back to on his or her own. And it becomes, sort of a transition item, a comfort item, and really helps them maintain control over what's happening now and what's going to happen next. So an example of that might be if, you're preparing a child for a funeral or a memorial service. A parent might create a short picture story that can be stick figures, nothing fancy, but, first we're going to, get up and get dressed in nice clothes, and we're going to get in the car, and we're going to drive to the church, and we're going to sit in the church, whatever the steps of the day may be, because the more the child can review that in advance, and sort of get used to it while they're not in that moment, the more successful they're going to be in that moment. Sometimes for older kids, or for kids just who have, different kinds of needs, you can do that even just as a checklist, right? So like, if the kid is a reader or not a reader, and you have pictures, but just making a checklist, that's a similar idea, just without any narrative. Wake up, get dressed in nice clothes, car, church, those kinds of things, that they can even check off as the day goes on, or, put a sticker next to the things they've done, or whatever the case may be. Again, a way for them to maintain control over a situation that they really have little control over, and really sort of adjust that way to what's happening. If there are instances that, in the midst of grief and lots of things happening quickly, this can't always happen. But if there's any way to practice some of the things that are coming up, even if you have a chance to drive to the cemetery the day before, or drive to the church, or take a walk around and see what it's going to look like, things like that. If there's an adult in their life who's not, in the position of grieving, but is connected to the child and can take on that role, that can also be really helpful. Again, like anything we can do to make an unfamiliar situation a little more familiar, will help the child, achieve more success.
Yeah. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. I know we're running short on time here, but I have a couple more practical questions, if that's all right. The first one I was thinking about is the fact that our culture has lots of euphemisms around death.
Yes, we do.
I'm guessing based on our discussion so far, that could pose some challenges. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. So, this goes back to really, what we started out with, this whole idea of metaphors and, grandma died. Why are you talking about a dinosaur? And all these things. And we don't even think about it, but it can be so incredibly confusing to children, and particularly children with some kind of special need or disability. The importance of our language is just, so remarkable. And we want to really avoid those euphemisms, right? Because if we start saying things that are so common in our culture, as you said, like, grandma passed away, or he's in a better place, or they're not with us anymore. A child is really left to their own devices to figure out what all that means. And the things that they're going to come up with are really much scarier and, much more amorphous than what we're actually talking about. So we want to use the actual words, which can be so hard for us as adults, right? Like you were talking about, like having to grapple with like the kid who just wants to talk about the science of death, and like we're dealing with our own emotions. It can be hard for us to say grandma died, but that's actually what happened, and then of course we need to help them understand through all of the different ways that we've talked about, over the past hour or so, what that means and what we're going to do with that information. But it's the direct word, it's the real language, and it's not a guessing game about what's the better place, maybe it's,
we lost dad or mom's gone. Well, let's go find them.
Well, where is mom?
Yeah.
Right.
And we should add that, we want to also respect cultural and religious traditions. So there are many traditions in which the concept of heaven, or the concept of, this mom who died is in the trees. And I think it's really important that we honor these traditions, and we can use sort of concrete language as a springboard as we start to explore the traditions in someone's own family. So we want to, of course, make sure we're honoring that, but also trying to be clear and, and not talk in an abstract manner.
Mm-hmm,
yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And speaking of honoring, I'm wondering if you have any tips or strategies for helping a child with autism to remember and to honor their parent who has died?
Well, I really, really appreciate this question, Jenny, because this is the crux of our grief work. We really want to help our kids with autism maintain their connection with the parent who died, and that's often really tricky for them when they're so concrete. And if the parent is just sort of not right there in the room in front of them, how do we even think about this person who's just not right here in the room in front of us? And in grief work, we have this idea of continuing bonds, this idea that we really want to find ways to stay connected to someone after their death. And in our children, and for our children with autism, we may need to help them make that connection a little bit more clearly because they may not come up with it themselves. So what we try to do is think about how can we support this child in finding an accessible and meaningful way to remember mom or dad. So maybe if this is a child who loves trains and dad loved to ride the subway with them, or they went on a memorable train ride together. Maybe next time the child's on a train or they see a train, that might be a way to help them make that connection. When I see that train, it reminds me of when you and dad used to love riding that train. And so helping them actually make that connection. We also, of course, with all kids, use many different strategies, including use of a memory box, sometimes pictures, and even a short picture story. It could be something that we use as a short picture story of ways that we remember mom or dad, but they just might need a little bit of extra support in making that connection.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. And can you tell us about your book? It's called I Have a Question About Death, is I believe your first book in the series. So
yes.
Who is that for, and what's the book about?
Yeah, so I Have a Question About Death is the first book in our I Have a Question series. It was actually supposed to be the only book, but then our publisher said, there are other challenging topics, but it's really, it was sort of where our passion started. The book is, it's a children's book, so it's intended for a parent or caregiver or therapist to read with the child who's experienced a loss.
A child of what age approximately?
Yeah, so it's approximately, 4 to 12, I would say, but we've definitely gotten a lot of feedback from early childhood educators who have been able to recommend it to younger children and certainly older children with, some developmental disabilities or things like that. It's certainly appropriate for. And the book consists of the actual narrative, the actual story, as well as a condensed short picture story that has fewer words and all of the same images as the regular story, so a child can really go back and read it on their own. And then there's also a section for parents and caregivers who, are the ones in the position of navigating this challenging time with their child. And so we really try to paint a picture for the children of what death is, what they can expect, at a funeral or some service. What are some things they can do if they're feeling overwhelmed or they're feeling sad, or if, some things, we didn't even touch on, like, people come in and they want to hug the kid, right? The kid is going through a hard time. They just want to hug him. And some kids, especially kids with autism, they don't want to be hugged, and so how can the child navigate that, and what can they do, and how can they safely take a break, and what are some strategies, that they can use. And so, the book really aims to help a child through all of those challenges, both in understanding what death is and then sort of navigating that grief process. And before I say just one more thing about the book, I do want to say that one thing we didn't really touch on in terms of the grief process is that, and it sort of goes along with the communication piece, is that sometimes we might see regressions of a child. Maybe they had mastered being potty trained and they're showing regression, or maybe they're having outbursts or tantrums in a way that they don't usually have or haven't had in a while. And these are all ways that children communicate with us, right? So we want to be sure that, as caregivers or parents, that we're not, punishing these things or feeling like our kid is going backwards or, being like so frustrated, but really understanding that that may be part of their grief process. And again, thinking about things that have been helpful to them in the past and applying those strategies to grief as well. And so, we hope that in our book we provided, these kinds of strategies and lots more to really be as useful as possible to parents and caregivers as they find themselves in these incredibly challenging positions. And our book is sold on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and most, places where books are sold. We're on Facebook and Instagram, and we have a website. And, we write a bunch of blogs and articles for various publications. And really, we're just hoping that when parents are facing such a difficult time in their life, that they don't have to search too far and wide to find some help and some support. And that's really what we're trying to provide.
Yeah, no, that's terrific. And what is your website, by the way?
It's www.ihaveaquestionbook.com.
Okay, super. I'll put that in the show notes, and I'll put the direct links to your book on Amazon as well. And I think one of the books in the series is specifically about cancer too.
Yeah, so the first book is I Have a Question About Death. The second one is I Have a Question About Divorce. And the third one is I Have a Question About Cancer. Okay, so would the cancer one potentially be of interest to any families who had cancer as part of their story? Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just say that for all of the books, we're not specific about who the loss is, so that any child can really sort of plant themselves in the book. They're all gender neutral, and they're all, pretty general in terms of who has died or who in their life has cancer, so that they really don't have to make any leaps like, oh, this book is talking about grandma, but it's really my dad, or it's really my sibling, or, those kinds of things. Okay. All right. No, that's cool. That's good. All right. So, hey, we are unfortunately reaching the end of our time today. So I'll just ask one last question here of each of you. So Arlen, let's start with you if you don't mind. If you could say one thing to widowed parents of kids with autism, what would it be? So first of all, I would say just continue to seek the support, knowing that you're not alone. The fact that you're even here and listening to this podcast, what a wonderful step. And to know that you have Jenny and people in this community, I think just reaching out to others. We know there's often no time, especially if you're a parent now trying to manage kids on your own. But we're so appreciative of podcasts like this and online resources that are available if it's hard to be getting out and seeing people in person. So continue to seek that support for yourself as you're continuing to support your children. And then the other thing I would just add is that even though it sometimes seems like the rest of the world has gone on, we know that grief has not just stopped. And in our grief work, we never use the word closure. We've stopped using closure in grief work because we know that there isn't one day that you just wake up and grief has ended. And so we really want to normalize that and just honor the fact that this is sort of trying to find the new normal, and know that the kids are continuing to find the new normal, and as that they continue to grow and develop, whether or not they have autism, they will continue to reprocess this experience and think about it in different ways as they continue to grow and develop. So just wanted to kind of put that out there. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. And Meredith? I would say to parents to remember that you are the expert on your child. And even though, you may not have navigated grief with your child before, and this may be a situation that's more challenging than anything you've experienced thus far, you are really the one who knows your child the best. and who knows what works for them and what doesn't work for them. And as challenging as this time may be, I would also want to help parents recognize that all of the work that they're doing to help their child navigate this loss and understand death and go through the grieving process are only going to serve them well in the future. That everything you do in order to get through this time is going to be things that you can build on when inevitably you and your child experience other challenges down the line, hopefully not another death, but other kinds of transitions, and that all of these things are building blocks to helping your child navigate difficult things successfully, and that, you know, you do have a community of support, and you do have hopefully a team of people, whether it's a therapist or a special educator or, you know, whatever the case may be, and, you know, not to be afraid to rely on them and call upon them for support, but also trust your instincts and trust the fact that you're the expert on your child.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. I think that's a great place to end today. So my guests today are Meredith Polsky and Arlen Gaines, who are both social workers and are co-authors of the I Have a Question book series, including their first book, I Have a Question About Death. So Arlen and Meredith, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thanks for having us. We really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you so much.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Arlen Gaines and Meredith Polsky as much as I did. You can find show notes and all the links at widowedparentpodcast.com. Look for episode 33. And I have an announcement to make about upcoming podcast programming. Tomorrow is the first day of August, and I'm going to pretend that I'm from one of those places where people sometimes get to take the whole month off. I'm going to take a break from new episodes and instead do reruns during the month of August. I'll be running the 4 most popular episodes to date, starting next week with number 4. Then I will return in September with some fantastic guests and topics. First up will be a discussion on parenting older teens and college students with the co-author of the new book, Grown and Flown, which is available now for pre-order before its September 3rd launch. After that, we'll have practical ideas for keeping the memories of our loved ones alive, an in-depth discussion around taking time off work, also known as a sabbatical, and so much more. And here's the other thing. While I'm off in August, I'm actually not really going to be off. I'm going to be working hard on my first book. The working title is Cancer and Caregiving, and it's a memoir based on my Caring Bridge journal from the time when my husband was terminally ill. I'll be sharing more about that as the month progresses. In the meantime, thanks for listening, and keep smiling.
Thank you for listening to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk. Connect with us on social media and at widowedparentpodcast.com.